Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Imagine waking up one day to find that everything you built, your job, your home, your savings, was gone. Not because of anything you did wrong, but because the entire economy had crumbled beneath your feet. That was the devastating reality for millions of Americans during the Great Depression, a period of prolonged economic despair that began with the 1929 stock market crash and stretched through most of the 1930s. But this story isn't just about numbers, bank failures, or policy shifts. It's about people. It's about how everyday Americans endured hunger, homelessness, and hopelessness, how families were torn apart, how children had to grow up too fast, and how entire communities were reshaped by the trauma. In this video, we're not just looking at the headlines, we're diving into the human experience. You'll learn what it was really like to live through the Depression, how people found ways to survive without jobs, how race and gender shaped the experience, how education and childhood were upended, and how resilience was often the only currency people had left. Stick around, because this is history that hits home. The stock market crash of October 1929 didn't just send shockwaves through Wall Street. It set in motion a catastrophic unraveling of the entire American economy. What began as a sharp decline in stock prices spiraled into something much deeper and more destructive. The roots of the crash lay in rampant speculation. Throughout the 1920s, millions of Americans poured their savings, and often borrowed money, into the stock market. Buying on margin became the norm, where people would pay only a fraction of a stock's price up front, borrowing the rest with the hope that profits would cover the difference. This worked as long as stock prices rose. But when prices began to fall, panic set in. On October 24, 1929, Black Thursday, investors began frantically selling. The slide worsened the following Monday and Tuesday, culminating in Black Tuesday, October 29th, when the market collapsed entirely. Billions of dollars were wiped out. The psychological blow alone was devastating, but the ripple effects were far worse. The crash shattered confidence in financial institutions. Banks had invested depositors' money into the market or had issued risky loans. When the market collapsed, banks began failing. Over 9,000 banks closed their doors in the 1930s, and people who had trusted those banks lost their life savings overnight. There was no federal insurance back then. Once the bank failed, your money was simply gone. Unemployment skyrocketed, from just 3% in 1929 to 25% by 1933. That meant 1 in 4 Americans couldn't find work. The gross domestic product, GDP, a measure of the economy's total output, plummeted by nearly 30%. With factories shutting down and farms going under, businesses couldn't pay workers couldn't buy goods, and the economy spiraled downward in a vicious cycle of decline. In just a few years, a thriving nation built on dreams of endless prosperity found itself in the grip of widespread despair. The crash hadn't just dented the economy, it shattered the illusion that America's future was untouchable. As the Great Depression deepened, the very structure of American life began to collapse. One job, one family, one dream at a time. With unemployment reaching 25%, entire industries ground to a halt. Factories closed, leaving assembly lines silent and workers with no income. Offices downsized or shuttered, pushing even white-collar professionals into joblessness. Farmers, already struggling with falling crop prices, were crushed by debt and forced off their land. There was no safety net, no unemployment insurance, no food stamps, no federal aid in the early years. You either found a way to survive or you didn't. In cities, breadlines stretched for blocks. Men, women, and children lined up for a simple meal of soup and bread, often provided by charities or churches. Soup kitchens became lifelines, serving as many as 1,000 people a day in some places. Yet the food was never guaranteed, and the shame of lining up for it weighed heavily on the American psyche. Homelessness soared, and with it came the rise of Hoovervilles, makeshift shantytowns named mockingly after President Herbert Hoover, who many blamed for the economic collapse. These settlements, built from scrap wood, metal, and cardboard, sprung up in city parks, riverbanks, and vacant lots. Entire families crowded into one-room shelters, sometimes heated only by a barrel fire. These diary entries offer more than just quotes. They are haunting glimpses into the raw human cost of the Great Depression. Behind the statistics and economic charts were real people whose lives were upended overnight. The mother in Chicago doesn't just describe poverty, she conveys the devastating fall from stability to desperation. Her words, "We used to be respectable," reveal the deep emotional and psychological loss of dignity that came with losing everything: job, home, and social standing. Living in a tent by the railroad wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a symbol of how far a family could fall in a country that once promised the American dream. Similarly, the man walking all day in the cold for work paints a picture of quiet resilience. His shoes, worn through with no money to repair them, reflect the physical toll of poverty. But it's the last line, "I don't know what else to do," that strikes hardest. It captures the emotional paralysis that so many felt. During this time, the exhaustion, the helplessness, and the gnawing uncertainty of what the future held. These aren't just isolated stories. They echo the experiences of millions. For many Americans, the Depression was not simply a matter of reduced income. It was a collapse of their world. The infrastructure that people relied on, their jobs, their savings, their sense of order, and possibility, vanished almost overnight. Families that had once celebrated modest achievements like buying a home or sending a child to school now measured success in terms of finding the next meal or keeping warm through the night. And perhaps, most tragically, it stripped away people's sense of identity and purpose. In a society where one's worth was often tied to employment and self-reliance, losing a job didn't just mean financial insecurity, it meant losing one's place in the world. Fathers, in particular, struggled with the shame of not being able to provide, while mothers fought to keep their families intact in the face of relentless hardship. Children grew up too fast, often leaving school to scavenge or work whatever odd jobs they could find. In essence, the Great Depression turned life into survival, and the weight of that survival, day after day, year after year, left scars that wouldn't heal easily. It wasn't just about feeding the body. It was about trying to keep the human spirit alive when everything around it seemed to be crumbling. The Great Depression didn't just reshape the economy, it tore through the core of American family life. As jobs vanished and financial pressure mounted, the traditional family structure began to fracture under the weight. Marriages were strained, and some men, overwhelmed by their inability to provide, simply walked away. Abandonment became tragically common. Fathers left home in search of work and never returned, while some parents, devastated and defeated, left their children behind, hoping someone else could offer them a better chance. This led to a haunting phenomenon: riding the rails. Thousands of teenagers, mostly boys but some girls too, took to freight trains in search of work, food, or just an escape from the crushing poverty at home. They became part of a transient youth culture, drifting across the country with nothing but hope and a few belongings. Many faced violence, hunger, or injury, but the promise of something better kept them moving. For children who remained with their families, life was no less difficult. Schools saw plummeting attendance as kids dropped out to take whatever work they could find, shining shoes, selling newspapers, or doing farm labor, to help keep their families afloat. Education, once seen as a path to upward mobility, became a luxury that many could no longer afford. The physical impact was severe. Malnutrition among children skyrocketed. Without enough food or a balanced diet, many suffered from stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and permanent developmental delays. In rural areas especially, families often survived on little more than potatoes, cornmeal, and whatever they could grow or barter for. Government studies from the 1930s documented widespread cases of underweight and sickly children, many of whom bore the long-term effects for the rest of their lives. But beyond the physical hardships, the emotional and psychological toll was just as devastating. Growing up amid constant fear of eviction, hunger, or family separation left deep scars. Children internalized their parents' stress and grief. Many learned to hide their emotions, adapt quickly, and shoulder adult responsibilities at an early age. The Depression stole their innocence, replacing play and learning with survival and sacrifice. Psychologists of the time began noting a rise in childhood anxiety and depression, even though there was little understanding or support for mental health back then. These children grew into adults shaped by trauma, more cautious, more frugal, and often haunted by memories of deprivation. In short, the Great Depression didn't just disrupt daily routines, it reshaped childhood itself. It created a generation that learned to live with less, to expect hardship, and to carry silent wounds from an era when the future seemed anything but certain. The Great Depression transformed the lives of American women in profound and often contradictory ways. As families faced economic ruin, women were thrust into roles that demanded incredible strength, sacrifice, and resourcefulness. They became the glue holding broken households together, not just emotionally, but economically. With every dollar stretched thinner, women were expected to make do with less food, less clothing, less heat, and still maintain some sense of stability for their families. In kitchens across the country, meals were improvised with whatever could be scrounged. Bread soaked in milk became breakfast, beans and potatoes were stretched into soups that lasted for days, and meat was a rare luxury. Women reused tea bags, patched clothes again and again, and turned flour sacks into dresses. The mantra of the time was simple: use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. At the same time, many women entered the workforce out of necessity, even as society wrestled with whether it was appropriate. Jobs traditionally seen as women's work became a lifeline. Secretarial positions, factory work, domestic labor like cleaning or cooking for wealthier families, these roles became common for women, even if the pay was meager and the hours long. But this rise in female employment sparked tensions, especially with soaring male unemployment. Many believed that every job a woman held was one a man should have. Some states and cities even passed laws limiting married women's ability to work, arguing it was unfair for a household to have two incomes while others had none. Yet despite this backlash, millions of women persisted, often becoming the sole breadwinners when their husbands lost work or abandoned the family. Still, the Depression also became a time of female resilience and community strength. Women leaned on one another, forming networks of mutual aid, swapping childcare duties, sharing canning recipes, trading clothing, and organizing community soup kitchens. Many planted relief gardens or victory gardens to grow their own vegetables and supplement limited rations. Sewing circles weren't just social, they were survival strategies. Some women rose to even greater roles. They organized strikes in garment factories, joined political movements advocating for labor rights, or worked within the growing number of social welfare programs launched under the New Deal. Though they faced double standards, low wages, and intense scrutiny, women became quiet engines of perseverance, not just enduring the Great Depression but helping families and communities hold together through it. The image of the exhausted mother hunched over a washboard, or sewing by lamplight, after a long day of work, came to symbolize not just suffering but endurance. These were women who bent without breaking, who adapted, who found ways to turn scarcity into survival. Their stories remind us that even in the bleakest times, resilience is often written in the smallest acts of care and creativity. The plight of American farmers during the Great Depression was a disaster within a disaster. Even before the stock market crash of 1929, many rural families were already struggling. After World War I, crop prices began to fall sharply due to overproduction and shrinking global markets. By the early 1930s, farmers were growing more than they could sell, and what little they could sell brought in pennies on the dollar. Debt mounted. Equipment couldn't be maintained. Taxes went unpaid. And banks, already stretched thin, began to foreclose on farms by the thousands. But what came next turned hardship into catastrophe: the Dust Bowl. From 1930 to 1936, and in 1980s, some places even longer, a massive environmental disaster swept across the Great Plains. Years of aggressive farming without proper soil conservation techniques, combined with a historic drought, created the perfect storm. With no grass or roots to hold the topsoil in place, the wind simply picked it up and carried it away. Black blizzards of dirt darkened the skies, choking livestock, burying homes, and blotting out the sun. Entire regions, parts of Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico, became uninhabitable. Families that had farmed the land for generations watched it turn to dust beneath their feet. Some tried to stay, sealing their windows with wet towels and covering their faces with handkerchiefs, but many had no choice but to leave. Over 2.5 million people were displaced from the Plains states during the 1930s, creating one of the largest internal migrations in American history. These migrants, often dubbed Okies regardless of their actual origin, piled into old cars and trucks and headed west, especially to California. They hoped to find work as farm laborers, picking fruit or vegetables in the Central Valley. What they found instead was exploitation, overcrowded camps, low wages, and resentment from locals. Many were forced to live in makeshift tent cities and endure brutal working conditions just to survive. Their suffering was immortalized in John Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath, which followed the fictional Joad family from Oklahoma as they traveled west in search of dignity and livelihood. The novel, drawn from real-life interviews and experiences, became a defining portrayal of Depression-era resilience and injustice. When the book was published in 1939, it gave voice to the voiceless and exposed the cruel realities of American poverty and migration. Yet even amid these dire circumstances, many Dust Bowl refugees clung to hope. They built communities on the fringes of towns. Children continued their education in overcrowded rural schools. Mothers found ways to cook over open fires, and fathers did backbreaking labor in orchards and fields for a few cents a day. Government programs like the Soil Conservation Service and later New Deal relief efforts began offering some support, teaching sustainable farming practices and offering employment through agencies like the WPA. The Dust Bowl wasn't just a story of weather, it was a collision of economic failure and environmental neglect, one that reshaped American agriculture and migration patterns for decades. And it served as a painful lesson in how ignoring the balance between human industry and nature can turn prosperity into ruin. For the farmers of the 1930s, it was more than just dust. It was the loss of everything they had ever worked for. For African Americans and other minority groups, the Great Depression magnified the inequalities that were already deeply entrenched in American society. While the entire country suffered, Black Americans were often last hired, first fired, a brutal reality that meant even the most basic financial stability was constantly under threat. In both northern cities and the segregated South, job opportunities for African Americans were scarce, and when jobs were available, they were typically the lowest paying, most grueling positions. White workers, themselves desperate, often demanded that Black workers be dismissed so they could take their places. The federal government's response to the Depression, though sweeping, was not always inclusive. Many New Deal programs excluded African Americans either through explicit rules or discriminatory practices at the local level. The Social Security Act, for example, initially excluded domestic workers and agricultural laborers, two of the largest employment sectors for Black Sea workers. Local administrators of the WPA and CCC often maintained segregation or gave Black workers fewer hours and lower wages. Yet in the face of these obstacles, resilience and activism surged. Black churches, mutual aid societies, and community leaders stepped up, providing food, shelter, and support where the federal system failed. Figures like A. Philip Randolph emerged as powerful voices for labor rights and racial equality. Randolph organized the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and pushed for greater inclusion of African Americans in federal work programs, laying the groundwork for the civil rights movement that would follow decades later. Latino communities faced similar hardship. In the Southwest, Mexican Americans, many of whom were born in the United States, were targeted in mass repatriation programs, where hundreds of thousands were forcibly deported or pressured to leave under the false pretense that they were taking jobs from real Americans. These efforts shattered families and stripped people of their rights and homes, often with no due process. Asian Americans, particularly in California, found themselves boxed into ethnic enclaves with limited economic mobility. Discrimination prevented many from accessing government aid, and anti-Asian sentiment rose as economic tensions worsened. Nonetheless, communities organized their own support networks through benevolent associations, temples, and family ties, sustaining each other through mutual aid and solidarity. Native American communities faced compounded challenges. Already struggling under the weight of generational poverty, assimilation policies, and loss of land, the Depression further devastated tribal economies. However, some relief came through the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, part of Roosevelt's New Deal, which reversed earlier assimilation policies and aimed to restore tribal governance and communal landholding. Though controversial and uneven in its impact, It marked a shift in federal policy that allowed some Native communities to regain a measure of autonomy. Despite systemic exclusion and discrimination, minorities during the Great Depression demonstrated extraordinary strength and ingenuity, creating their own safety nets and resistance movements in the absence of broader societal support. Their stories are a powerful reminder that the fight for survival often ran parallel with the fight for dignity, justice, and recognition. In the face of overwhelming hardship, everyday Americans turned to creativity, cooperation, and community to survive. Bartering systems sprang up across the country, especially in rural towns and struggling urban neighborhoods. With money scarce or worthless, people exchanged goods and services: eggs for firewood, sewing for produce, childcare for repairs. These informal economies helped keep people afloat when formal systems failed. Community pooling became essential. Families would share meals, take in relatives, or rotate who got to eat first when food was limited. Neighbors formed support networks, helping one another fix homes, share firewood, or lend tools. This grassroots solidarity created a powerful, if invisible, safety net during the darkest days of the Depression. On the fringes of society, a hobo culture emerged, composed mostly of unemployed men who took to the rails in search of work, food, or simply the hope of something better. These men developed a coded language, symbols scratched onto fences, posts, and train cars, to communicate which homes might offer a meal, which towns were dangerous, or where to find work. A drawing of a smiling cat meant a kind-hearted woman lived nearby. A simple circle with 2 arrows signaled that the town wasn't worth stopping in. This subculture, though often stigmatized, was a lifeline for thousands. Churches, synagogues, and local charities played a central role in relief efforts. Even when national programs were slow to arrive or selectively applied, faith communities provided soup kitchens, clothing drives, and makeshift shelters. Volunteers, many of whom had little themselves, gave their time and labor to help others. These efforts weren't just about survival. They were about preserving human dignity in a time of widespread despair. In countless small ways, Americans adapted to the crisis by repurposing and reusing everything they could. Old clothes were mended until threadbare. Furniture was repaired, not replaced. Children made toys out of scraps. The use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without mindset became a national ethos. It wasn't just about frugality, it was about resilience. These survival strategies reveal a crucial truth about the Great Depression. While it was an era marked by hardship, it was also a time of profound ingenuity, generosity, and shared humanity. People didn't just endure the Depression, they adapted to it together. When Franklin D. Roosevelt took office in 1933, the United States was in its deepest state of despair. Unemployment hovered around 25%, banks were collapsing, and faith in the government had nearly vanished. Roosevelt's first challenge wasn't just fixing the economy, it was restoring hope. One of his most powerful tools wasn't economic policy, but his fireside chats. These radio broadcasts, delivered in a calm, reassuring tone, brought the president into American homes. He explained complex issues in plain language and made people feel like they weren't alone. For many, it was the first time they felt truly heard by their government. But Roosevelt didn't stop at words. He launched the New Deal, an unprecedented series of programs aimed at economic relief, recovery, and reform. For millions of Americans, these programs made a real difference. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, put young men to work planting trees, building parks, and restoring the land, earning a small wage while sending money back home. The Works Progress Administration, WPA, created jobs in everything from construction to the arts, funding thousands of public works projects like schools, roads, bridges, and murals that still stand today. Perhaps the most transformative long-term reform was Social Security, introduced in 1935. It provided income for the elderly and unemployed, creating a foundation for future safety net programs. For ordinary Americans, this was more than just money. It was a lifeline, a reassurance that their country would stand by them in old age or hard times. Yet the New Deal wasn't perfect. Many programs excluded African Americans, Latinos, and women either directly or through systemic discrimination. For example, domestic and agricultural workers, sectors where many minorities were employed, were excluded from Social Security. And while the WPA did employ women, they were often relegated to low-paying women's work. Still, despite its flaws, the New Deal marked a fundamental shift in how Americans viewed the role of government, not just as a regulator, but as a protector. The long-term effects of the New Deal are still visible today. The Social Security system remains a core part of American life. Infrastructure built by WPA workers continues to serve communities. And the idea that government should step in during economic crises has become a lasting legacy, one echoed during future downturns like the 2008 recession and the COVID-19 pandemic. In many ways, the New Deal changed not only the course of the Depression, it changed the American identity. It proved that in the face of collapse, resilience wasn't just found in communities or families, but could also be forged through bold, collective action on a national scale. The Great Depression didn't just leave a mark on wallets, it left deep emotional and cultural scars that would shape American identity for generations. In the face of overwhelming hardship, people turned to movies and radio not just for entertainment, but for survival of the spirit. Hollywood boomed during the 1930s, offering glittering fantasies of wealth and romance that stood in stark contrast to real life. Films like The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind transported audiences to other worlds, while gangster films and screwball comedies helped people laugh through the pain. At home, families gathered around radios to hear The Shadow, Amos and Andy, or Roosevelt's latest fireside chat. Shared moments of comfort in uncertain times. Yet even as escapism provided relief, a wave of music and literature born from struggle offered a raw, honest reflection of life. Folk musicians like Woody Guthrie sang of dust storms, joblessness, and the forgotten man, his guitar famously bearing the message, "This machine kills fascists." Writers like John Steinbeck, through novels like The Grapes of Wrath, captured the haunting reality of migration, poverty, and perseverance, giving voice to those left out of the national narrative. Culturally, the Depression instilled values that lingered long after the economy recovered. A spirit of frugality and resourcefulness took hold. People learned to mend, reuse, and stretch every penny. Use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without wasn't just a slogan. It was a way of life. This era birthed the DIY mentality and a deeper appreciation for community resilience and mutual aid. Perhaps most significant was the shift in how Americans viewed the government and the economy. Before the Depression, many saw economic failure as a personal fault, but the collapse revealed that systemic forces, banks, stock markets, government policies, had real power over individual lives. This sparked a deep distrust in financial institutions, but also a growing belief that government had a duty to intervene, to protect, and to help. It was a turning point. Americans no longer expected to go it alone. They demanded a safety net, and they began to hold leaders accountable for economic justice. In this way, the Depression didn't just change the landscape of American culture, it rewrote its emotional DNA, instilling both a hard-earned caution and a stubborn belief in collective strength. As we reflect on the Great Depression nearly a century later, its lessons feel eerily relevant. The financial crash of 2008, the economic fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic, inflation, job insecurity, these events have reminded us how vulnerable modern economies still are and how quickly the ground can shift beneath us. Like in the 1930s, millions found themselves suddenly out of work, unsure of how to make ends meet, facing long lines at food banks and struggling to pay rent or mortgages. One of the clearest takeaways is the importance of safety nets. Programs like unemployment insurance, Social Security, and food assistance, many born from the New Deal, remain lifelines for millions. They don't solve every problem, but they offer a crucial buffer that didn't exist when the Depression hit. We've also seen how vital community resilience is. Local aid networks, mutual aid groups, and neighborhood initiatives that step in where larger systems sometimes fail. Just like Depression-era churches, community kitchens, and barter systems, these modern support webs remind us that survival often depends not on institutions, but on each other. But perhaps the most enduring lesson is this: the power of ordinary people to endure extraordinary times. The Great Depression tested the American spirit in ways few could have imagined, but it didn't break it. People adapted, helped one another, and found strength in solidarity. That same grit and ingenuity still exists today. Whether it's someone learning new skills after a layoff, families planting gardens in food deserts, or neighbors organizing to protect their homes, the legacy of resilience lives on. In a world still facing economic uncertainty, the Great Depression offers more than a history lesson. It's a mirror and a warning, but it's also a testament to human strength. When the systems fail, people don't have to. We just have to remember what those who came before us already proved. We're tougher than we think. The Great Depression wasn't just a downturn in the economy. It was a breakdown of everyday life. Jobs vanished, homes were lost, families were torn apart, and entire communities were forced to adapt in real time. From Wall Street to wheat, fields, from bustling cities to dusty plains, no corner of American life was left untouched. It reshaped how people thought about work, government, family, and even hope itself. Now take a moment to ask yourself, would you have survived the Great Depression? How would you have coped without a job or with your savings wiped out overnight? Would you have stayed and fought to rebuild or hopped a train west in search of a better tomorrow? Let me know in the comments. I want to hear your thoughts. What would you have done differently? If you found this video powerful or eye-opening, give it a like, subscribe for more hidden chapters of history, and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you don't miss what's next. Coming up, what life was really like in a Hooverville. A deep dive into the makeshift communities built from desperation and determination. Or check out the untold stories of the Dust Bowl migrants, where we follow the journey of families who fled the barren heartland for a shot at survival in the West. History lives in the lives of real people, and their stories deserve to be remembered.